Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. And today we're going to discuss GDPR and data protection and how to ensure compliance and minimize the risk of penalties with ISO 27701. My name is Mike Boutwell, and I'm joined by Lisa Goldsmith. Hello, Lisa. Welcome.
Hello. Hi. Hello, everyone.
So, Lisa, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Goldsmith. I am a digital IT and GDPR consultant here in the UK.
And I'm Mike Boutwell, like I just mentioned, and I'm an information security and risk management professional. I have 15 years of experience, and well, let's get into our presentation. So today we're going to discuss the importance of data protection and understanding data collection and the challenges around it, GDPR and the key principles of GDPR, who GDPR applies to and its global implications, and how it ties into the ISO 27701 standard, privacy by design, dealing with IT in relation to privacy on a daily basis, training and awareness, audit, data discovery, risk assessments, and then we'll close with a Q&A. Okay, here we go. Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'll start from here. So before we begin to talk about actual data protection and its importance, it's really a good place to start to think about the modern digital landscape. And while digital transformation is a bit of a buzzword, the actual transformation happens within organisations as a result of digital, and obviously data is quite a key part of that. So it's happening everywhere, and the impact of that, it impacts actually our personal lives and our professional lives as human beings. So with the rapid pace of how digital is moving globally, there's been a surge in data collection across all industries and all corners of the world. Now, when we think about everything from shopping online, networking and sharing data across social channels, staying connected, enhancing our careers, even down to things like using smartphones, the Internet of Things, and controlling our heating from our homes, or even switching on our washing machines through apps, the proliferation of data and its use of it is ever increasing, and it's on a significant scale. So when we think about that, we need to think about the sort of surge in data collection. So next slide, please.
Okay.
So with the growing surge in data collection, businesses need to be able to deliver, and consumers desire high quality products, services and experiences, and the need to collect greater quantities of data at speed and at scale also requires people to entrust you with their data. And that's not just, that's companies generally, globally, and often without people even fully understanding exactly what you'll be doing with their data, where it goes, how it's even accessed, who else has access to it, and where it's stored, or how it's kept secure. So for businesses, social enterprises, charity, all corporations across all sizes and all sectors really need to think more about data and the way that it's used, that's both for the benefit of them and their customers. So really it's on both the public at large and in a professional capacity. So we really need to understand both the risks of processing personal data and also the obligations of our organisations to ensure that data is used ethically. Next slide, please. So when we think about personal data, it's a valuable asset, and that's both for the organisations and individuals. And we really need to make sure that the data is used correctly. And really, when it is used correctly, it can really transform businesses and, as I say, personal lives for the better. So when we think about data protection compliance, it's not really just regulatory, it's actually a requirement and a fundamental responsibility for organisations to make sure that you can comply. Next slide, please.
Oh, yeah. So here we go.
So when we think about security and with cybercrime, information theft is ever growing, and it's estimated that the global cybercrime and the risk is going to be around $10.5 trillion annually by 2025. So that's quite a significant, sadly, it's quite a significant amount of money that cyber criminals can actually make through misuse of personal data and committing cybercrime. So falling victim to that can lead to severe financial, reputational, legal consequences for organisation. And in an era where data breaches are more common, protecting consumer data is really imperative for building and maintaining trust and brand reputation. So we need to really think about these things when we think about the types of data that we're processing, but also the levels of security and measures that we deploy against the data to keep it safe. So we need to have a balanced risk assessment of that and make sure that we're doing what we need to do to protect the data. Next slide, please. So when we think about data protection, there's lots of different laws and regulations globally, and whilst GDPR is one of the strongest privacy laws, several countries, and they're not all listed here, but several countries have actually looked to implement laws that take some of the best practices from the GDPR.
Okay.
Sorry, my screen has gone blank, so apologies.
Okay.
Are you still there?
Yep. I'm here.
Yeah, apologies. I don't know what's happening to my screen. I can't see the slides, so apologies.
Okay. So we're still on the importance of data protection and talking about the global regulations. Oops, here we go.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Right. I've got the slides back. Huge apologies for that. So yeah, there's lots of different regulations that have been deployed across the globe. As I say, they're not all listed here, but there are several of them that listed here. And whilst they're not directly linked to the GDPR as being one of the strongest privacy laws, some of these other laws have actually adopted various aspects of that, whether it be from adopting some of the principles and the practices. Some of these regulations have adopted the level of fines that are imposed under the GDPR, and then several of them are also if we could move to the next slide, please.
Sure. Oops, here we go.
So again, when we think about the consequences of data protection, we've already mentioned just briefly that the risks really are around financial risk, reputational risk, legal risk. So when we think about financial risk, there's both penalties from the EU supervisory authorities and also the UK supervisory authority, but there is also the fact that individual consumers can come to you for direct compensation. So there's quite a heavy financial risk in terms of loss of income, loss of customers. So there's quite a big risk there right across the board. Reputationally, this can be very detrimental and have an impact on your organisations because consumers will lose trust. So they're less likely to give you information. So operationally, that will impact your business. And then legally, this could result in temporary or permanent ban on processing data, suspending data transfers to third countries. So there's quite a wide range of implications that this can have for you as an organisation. So if we move to the next slide and think about understanding data collection challenges, we need to think about why organisations collect data. So organisations collect data to understand customer behaviour, improve products and services, make informed business decisions, and also to comply with certain legal and regulatory requirements. So whether that be financial, employment law, there's all different types of things that we need to collect data for. So when we think about those different types of data, That ranges from anything from personal data such as basic contact information, IP address information, financial, transactional data. Again, we're talking about demographic data. There's all types of data, particularly around equality, diversity and inclusion. So the nature and type of data that we collect can be quite challenging for organisations, particularly in terms of how you connect it and how you keep it safe. So we also need to think about the challenges insofar as ensuring that data is accurate, that we're, in terms of maintaining large volumes of data, how do you keep that secure? How do you keep it up to date? And also complying with, again, some of those privacy laws from around the world. So we're not just thinking about here in terms of the GDPR, whilst we are talking about that, but we need to think about how that impacts and where that crosses over with other regulations. So data accuracy is really important. It's one of the key things around the GDPR and in terms of being able to keep the information up to date and make sure that you can comply with the GDPR. So there are lots of ethical and legal considerations. So that whether that be from making sure that you've got informed consent, respecting people's privacy, making sure that people have got the right choice, really. Where there is a choice, people should be given a choice. And actually, the ways in which your organisation needs to use data, you need to make an assessment of whether you can achieve the same purpose without processing the data. So there's all sorts of ethical challenges that we have around the information that we need to collect.
Right.
So moving to the next slide, if we think about the introduction to the GDPR, so just in terms of what the data protection GDPR is, it's a regulation that focuses on the protection of privacy and personal data of individuals. It applies to both organisations and individuals within the EU and the UK, and also those outside of the EU and UK who offer goods or services to UK or EU citizens. So if your business operates within the EU or you are providing services to individuals within the EU or the UK, then you need to think about your compliance obligations with the GDPR. So what the GDPR also does is gives greater control to individuals whose data is being processed. And we've talked about one of those elements in terms of giving them that control and giving them a choice. But the GDPR also sets out a risk-based approach for processing personal data, and it promotes good practice within organisations to help you to use data responsibly, but also whilst balancing the needs of the individuals and protecting their privacy. So in terms of the GDPR, that came into effect on the 25th of May 2018. And moving on to the next slide, when we think about the key principles of the GDPR, the first one is really around lawfulness, fairness and transparency. So the first thing is, can you achieve the same purpose without processing personal data? If the answer to that question is yes, then you don't have a lawful basis for processing the data. But where you do have a lawful basis for processing data, you need to make sure that the way you use it is fair and that you're transparent with individuals when you're doing so. So that will be through things like your privacy notice and that type of thing. When we think about the principle of purpose limitation, that means that when you collect personal data and use it, you only use it for the original purpose that you intend to use it for. So that would mean not collecting it for one purpose and then using it for something completely different. When we think about data minimisation, I know Mike is going to talk much more about this in greater depth, but this is really about making sure that you only collect the data you need. So not collecting information because you may need it. It's about collecting what you need for those purposes and making sure that you're not collecting and storing too much. Data accuracy, this is about keeping your data up to date, making sure that you've got sufficient measures in place to make sure that people can update their information, that you're able to update information and keep it accurate. Storage limitation, this is really around retention periods, how long you should be keeping information for. And how long you keep information for might be determined by other regulations like financial laws, again, employment, it could be all manner of things, but also the purposes that you need to use data for will also determine how long you would need to keep it for. So when we think about integrity and confidentiality, this is really around the security, and this is around physical security and also cyber. digital security and how you keep the information safe, both in collection, storage, transit, wherever it's shared, making sure that you've got the right security mechanisms in place. And then last but not least, we've got the principle of accountability. And actually, Mike is going to talk much more about that in the standard that we're just about to discuss in the next few slides. And this is really about demonstrating how you comply with the GDPR, having robust documentation, having robust review measures in place, making sure that you've got the right mechanisms in place to keep the information safe. So moving on again to the next slide. So when we think about the requirements of the GDPR, really what you need to be doing is looking at identifying who within your organisation has responsibility for compliance, thinking about completing a discovery process on your data, and again, Mike will talk about that in more detail. Auditing your existing documentation, and again, Mike will cover that in ISO 27701, and that's really around identifying the policies and documentation you have in place and reviewing that existing documentation, including things like privacy notices. You need to identify that lawful basis. So when I talked about your processing being lawful, you need to identify that lawful basis for your processing activities. You need to think about appointing a data protection officer if that's appropriate for your organisation, and you need to think about carrying out a gap analysis to identify any key areas of focus that you need to think about from your organisation perspective. And then you need to think about putting training in place for staff, volunteers, any stakeholders, and communications plans to make sure that you can roll out processes or any of your GDPR compliance measures and make sure that all parties that have a stake in that understand and that they're able to comply with that. And then moving on to the next slide, this is just a quick bit of information about penalties for non-compliance. So if you're in direct breach of any of those principles that I mentioned previously, it can carry a fine of up to 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover, whichever is higher. If you're in breach of the GDPR but is less severe, it's not in direct breach of those principles, it can be up to 10 million euros or 2% of global turnover. And again, as mentioned previously, individuals do have the right to claim direct compensation from you. So on the next slide, when we think about who does the GDPR apply to and the global implications, if we start really, as mentioned already, the GDPR applies to all organisations that have an establishment within the EU or the UK, or where you are providing services to EU or UK citizens. The scope of the GDPR goes beyond the UK and the EU, as just mentioned there, and it's really around making sure that as a business, you've got robust data collection processes, that you're able to transfer data, making sure that you're transferring data to countries that do have an adequacy decision, so you're able to freely transfer data to other countries. You do need to appoint a representative within the EU if you are processing EU citizen data or you are operating within the EU, and you need to make sure that your policies and your procedures reflect that. And then really in terms of the consequences of non-compliance, we've covered those in a fair bit of detail already, but it really is that reputational risk. And whilst it's not necessary that you would get the higher end of the fine would be proportionate to the level of level of impact that you could that could be incurred on individuals if you have a breach or a loss of data, or you breach one of those principles of the GDPR. So really, fundamentally, my personal opinion is whilst financial damage can be quite severe, the reputational damage of people not trusting you with their data is actually potentially far more severe.
All right, thank you very much, Lisa. So I'll continue from here. So we're going to get a little bit mixed up in a lot of numbers between ISO 27701 and 27001. So I'll try to simplify it. So ISO 27701 is a privacy information management system. ISO 27001 is an information security management system. They're related in the fact that a lot of people kind of use privacy and information security or cybersecurity as interchangeable concepts, but they're really not. So cybersecurity, as an example, or information security would be how you protect particular data. In the case of data, that could be, for example, business information that doesn't have any personally identifiable information. Whereas with a privacy focus, like a privacy information management system, the focus is much more on protecting personally identifiable information. Nevertheless, the two go hand in hand because a lot of systems are going to be processing personally identifiable information, and you're going to need to do much more than actually using 27701 as the basis for all of the controls that you implement within your IT systems and your business. So this is really where it gets into the discussion of 27001 and 2, where there's a very long list of extensive controls. And if organizations wish to seek an ISO 27701 certification, they also need to seek an ISO 27001 certification, which is a significant project. So the point of this is really to enhance the overall protection from a comprehensive perspective. There's a lot of aspects, like Lisa touched on, the integrity and the accessibility of that data. Within GDPR, for example, there's a right to be forgotten. If there's an issue with accessibility, for example, the system, some outside intruder gets into the system and disrupts it for a period of time, then the users who, for example, if they want to use this right to be forgotten feature by deleting their own data, that's not going to be possible. So both of these international standards go hand in hand. And the benefit of implementing ISO 27701 is the fact that you have a framework that you can follow. And it's basically, again, Lisa talked about having a gap analysis or doing a gap analysis. So when you have a framework to follow, you can basically compare what you have currently in existence today versus the framework. And the gap analysis is at a very high level, fairly straightforward. And it makes things a lot simpler. Understanding GDPR can be a little bit more complicated, so it's much easier to follow a framework. So in this concept, we're going to talk, or this slide, we're going to talk about privacy by design. Privacy by design, you can think of it in the best or the easiest terms in the fact that before GDPR was enacted, there weren't many pieces of software products out there that offered privacy by design. It was really a niche market for that. And then after GDPR came into enactment, privacy by design became pretty much a requirement for many business applications that collected personally identifiable information. What this means is that it adheres to given privacy regulations by default. And so there's 7 foundational principles. I'm going to talk about 3 of them, but I'll list them all. So there is privacy as the default setting, proactive adherence to privacy best practices, privacy embedded to the design, full functionality of privacy features, end-to-end security, visibility and transparency, respect for user privacy. And so really, privacy by design focuses on adhering to the regulation by default. And what that means and why it's so important and why it's so key is that when you're building, let's say, a software product that end users are going to put their personal data through, it ensures that day one, when users start using that tool or software, that it is compliant with the privacy regulations of your local jurisdiction. And then this also gives users a good feeling with the full functionality and visibility and transparency principles, where they can know that they have full control of their data in accordance with these regulations. So these foundational principles really give some users, especially users who are privacy conscious, a lot better confidence or more confidence in their ability to manage their own information. So a real world example of privacy by design would be, for example, if you want to go into Google Docs, let's say you're using Google Docs for work, and you can download your data and delete your data. And previously, it wasn't always available in SaaS tools where you can actually own your data. In a lot of other tools, you can just do a full extract of all of the data that you've used, let's say on social media or other tools like that. IT's role in data protection is very fundamental in the fact that our world is highly digitized, like Lisa had mentioned earlier. And so pretty much everything that we do has some sort of digital component in it. So with that, it means that whether your organization is adhering to the controls, enforcing the controls, they all have to go through people who are in some way or form associated with IT. This could mean inputting encryption or adding firewalls or other technical controls to protect the data, and implementing the security controls, let's say in accordance with the ISO 27001 standard. Then in the case that you're going to be audited for compliance related to a privacy regulation, then these personnel within your IT organizations are going to need to hand over the evidence that you're complying to policies and regulations. And not only that, because they're supporting the underlying IT systems, they're going to need to understand what their exact expectations are and what regulations they have to comply with, and why they're actually doing these sort of activities. So why does an IT administrator care about handing over specific data to an auditor? And why is it important that they raise awareness about these specific activities? Let's say there's a particular project and the stakeholders within that project are adhering to privacy regulation fundamentals. And so it helps facilitate the best practice of adhering to privacy by design by training the employees involved in IT. So, okay, data minimization. Again, this is a topic that Lisa touched on. Not only is this great in supporting GDPR, but it's also going to simplify everyone's life and the entire organization if you take a data minimization approach. And what this really means is that if you don't need the data that you're collecting, then it's best not to collect it, especially later on when it comes down to compliance with privacy regulations. And if you're just starting on your journey with privacy regulations, then you're going to have to do a data discovery, which is something we're going to touch on in a moment. But the point is that the more data that you have, the more complicated it's going to be to move along on your journey or process or progress on your journey to become more compliant or enhance your compliance. So it's always better to simplify where possible. And one of the best ways how to do that is through data minimization. So you need to identify if you actually need that data, if there is a business case behind it, and the actual steps that you need to conduct when minimizing data is you need to define the purpose of the data in which you're collecting, and then that's pretty much the foundational principle of that. So you identify why you're collecting that data. If you don't have a good reason, then that's a very good sign that that data is probably not something that you actually need for your business and you don't need to collect. And then you have to regularly review data to check if it's actually needed, and if it doesn't need to be deleted. And then there's also additional considerations with the data retention policies, which come into play there. So next, here we go. Awareness and training. Yeah, so
should I take this?
Yep, go
Yeah.
ahead. Go ahead.
Brilliant. So in terms of awareness and training, it's a critical role really for the organisation, ensuring that data protection is adhered to. It's not just about having the policies and procedures in place, it's actually also about ensuring that everyone understands and follows those policies. So the standards that Mike has just talked about is a really good way of being able to work through that process and implement those measures that you need in place. So there are different audiences for this. So whether that be employees who handle data, the management who make the decisions, any customers, anyone really who has a stake in the data that you collect, they need to be informed about how the data is used or should be used. So when we think about data protection training, we need to understand not only the importance of data protection and the principles and the regulations, but we need to understand the basics of data security, data minimization, privacy by design, and how to respond to data breaches and that type of thing. So really, it's best to develop a training program, including identifying the needs of those different audiences, developing the materials and resources that support that, scheduling in your training sessions, and ensuring that the training is engaging and interactive, because it's quite a dry subject sometimes. So it's really about giving those practical examples of how it actually, how it applies in the day-to-day role of the individuals. So we really need to think that about the awareness campaigns, and there needs to be regular communications, updates, reminders about data protection, as well as doing things like celebrating Data Protection Day or participating in any other relevant events. So we need to think about really thinking about how we put these practices into place and how we measure the effectiveness of that, whether that be by reporting on how many incidents or breaches you might have, reporting on the types of data you're collecting, the volume. Is really about making sure that we can measure the success of our compliance.
Okay. All right.
Over to Mike.
All right, so in this slide, we're going to talk about data discovery. So data discovery is really all about knowing what kind of data that your organization possesses. This is very important to understand. Again, this goes hand in hand with data minimization. If you're going to go on a data discovery journey, you want to figure out if you need the data, and that first starts off by scoping what the data landscape is, which could be your IT asset inventory, for example. It could be databases or any other pieces of equipment that could handle data. This could be physical or it could be digital. And then you identify where the data goes, the data flows, and the relationship within the IT landscape of what kind of processes are in place which support the processing of the data that you actually have. And then where that data is stored, that needs to be identified, and classifying that data based on the sensitivity or regulatory requirements. This is another key point. If you don't have any personally identifiable information, then it simplifies things incredibly. And then if you have PII, then you need to figure out what kind of PII is it, how sensitive it is. Is it highly sensitive because it contains maybe political affiliations or something of that matter? And then creating a data inventory to understand what kind of pieces of data that you have so that it can be managed. And then data comes with certain risks. So you need to conduct risk assessments in accordance with that data. So again, if you have personally identifiable information, but very few controls to secure that data, or maybe to manage that in accordance with GDPR, for example. A risk assessment needs to be done to quantify exactly what that means to the business. And so the data discovery and the risk assessment goes really hand in hand, because you can't really quantify the potential impact of risky data if you don't understand what the implications of that data are. So if you have a data breach of, let's say, meaningless data, let's say pictures of, I don't know, birds or animals or whatever, something completely useless that has no impact, versus something that's a very strict violation of GDPR that's going to have a massive impact to a business. So understanding the actual data that you have through data discovery facilitates the risk assessment, and it quantifies it in terms that can really be understood. Okay. All right. So in conclusion today, we discussed GDPR and the key principles behind GDPR, and how ISO 27701 supports GDPR or adherence to other privacy regulations, the importance of data discovery and risk assessments and how they go hand in hand, privacy by design as the default approach that organizations should take, the importance of data minimization and the way it helps organizations comply with GDPR, and the role of IT organizations with in relation to data protection. And Lisa discussed training and awareness and how to get the most out of a training and awareness program. And then finally, I'd like to thank everyone as we conclude, and we're going to take some questions now. So let's see if we have questions in the chat here.
Yes, thanks Mike and Lisa for delivering this very informative webinar. Just to remind you that PCB offers training and certification courses which will show your dedication in managing data protection frameworks, and most importantly, you will get recognized worldwide. Okay, now without further ado, we'll go ahead and answer some of the questions from the attendees. The first question is there any rules around who can store data for how long in different fields, like banking, insurance, medical, etc.?
Yeah, I can take this one, and then Lisa, if you want to add on to anything I say, go for it. But yes, there are rules. It varies by jurisdiction and by data type. So most of these are around data retention. So it specifies how long data must be held on file. For example, in the case of let's say a financial fraud, organizations, like if a government is going to do an investigation, they need to be able to contact that bank and get the banking information. And then, well, this is a key component. So if data is about to be aged out through data retention, so if it's about to expire, there's a key component called a legal hold. So data can be put on a legal hold, which means it's required for a legal reason, for example, an investigation, or could be many other reasons. But basically, data can be kept on file longer than the retention period for legal holds. I don't know if Lisa, you want to touch on anything I missed, maybe?
No, I think specifically to that question, no, that's correct. But there will be, for anyone who's got any questions about any other types of particular data storage and by field, really it's about looking at what those local regulations are, not just financial, but any other regulation that really exists. That would be from adoption law through to absolutely anything. So it's really on a case-by-case basis to be aware of what the regulation says and how that fits in with privacy and GDPR and any data protection laws.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks, Lisa and Mike. Okay, the other question is, in your opinion, what's the must-have GDPR checklist that all kinds of organizations requiring to be compliant with GDPR need to follow as guidance and build their processes around it?
Okay, I'll take this one. Do you, Lisa, did you say something?
No, just saying, go ahead.
Okay, I don't think it's that straightforward. I think ISO 27701 can help facilitate the process, but I believe that the first thing you need to understand is what regulation that you're going to comply to, which is, okay, GDPR. And then you need to understand what kind of data that you're processing and what exactly you're doing with that data. And then you need to understand the risks of non-compliance or the risk of processing that data. And then from there, you can begin to understand and kind of identify gaps. Again, using both ISO 27701 can help facilitate the adherence to that. But in terms of a single checklist, I don't think one really can exist, because also, even though GDPR is EU-wide, and then there's also global implications, within each individual European Union nation, they have their different interpretations of GDPR. And there's a theoretical component and a practical component, whereby in theory, everyone adheres to GDPR the way the European Union has set out. But in practice, not every nation within the EU actually agrees on all of the principles. And not only that, not only do all of those businesses not adhere to those principles as strictly as they should, or it's basically pretty open-ended and not very straightforward. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach. Yep.
I would agree with that.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Mike. The other question is, if a company has ISO 27001 and 27701 certification, would they be in compliance with GDPR?
It's a good question.
Mm.
I would say they could be. It would be a very good sign, but it doesn't necessarily mean yes. So and also, if you're going to be, let's say, audited for whatever reason by a regulator, which it happens from time to time, or if complaints about GDPR are going to come up and your organization is going to be investigated or audited in some way, so the EU or any other organization which is doing that audit is not going to accept an ISO certification as compliance to GDPR. And they're not one and the same. ISO 27701 facilitates adherence to privacy regulations, but it's not a replacement or let's say, an attestation or certification that you de facto adhere to GDPR.
Yeah, I would also say that compliance isn't an end point, it's a continual process. And things change, the way you operate as an organisation, the data you collect and everything around that can change. So it is an iterative process. And I think even back when the GDPR came into force, I won't mention which, but I think there was one of the supervisory authorities within the EU that said, look, we hold our hands up, we're not quite there yet, because it's really 100% compliance. It's not impossible, but actually that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. You should do everything you can, and the policies and procedures will help with that. But it is, as I say, the key point there is it's not an end point. It's an actual continual process.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. How possible do you think is it to force GDPR to countries outside of Europe?
Well, go ahead, Lisa. Go ahead. You started to speak.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a law that does impact outside of the UK and the EU. So as mentioned previously, if you operate as a business within the UK or the EU, or indeed you process personal data on citizens that reside within the UK or the EU, then you do need to comply, and your organisation can be subject to enforcement action or reprimands or types of legal implications, even though you are not necessarily within the EU. So it is something that is enforced. or should be enforced. So it's something to definitely take seriously and think about what that means for your organisation.
Yep, and there have been numerous fines of entities that don't reside in the EU. Numerous. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's probably everything for today. And don't forget to go to the PECB Insights Conference that's being hosted in Paris this year or on October 2nd and 3rd, and you can purchase your ticket on the PECB website. I'm going to be there. I don't know if Lisa, if you plan to be there. Do you plan to be there?
I definitely will try. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
I just
All right.
provided I'm available. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. So
Okay.
thanks to everyone for watching, and thanks for the questions, and I hope it was valuable for everyone. And thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks to both of you, and thanks to the audience that were with us today. Please be informed that this session is recorded and it will be posted on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.